She's my landlady. 15 years older, impossibly confident, and tonight, she says I don't owe her rent. I owe her me. The first time I stepped into the apartment building, I wasn't sure what to expect. The hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and something floral, a subtle fragrance that seemed almost alive, lingering in the air like a quiet invitation. My new home was small, but warm, with sunlight spilling through the narrow windows and casting golden patterns on the floor. I felt a mix of nervous anticipation and curiosity, the usual jitters of moving into a new space, but there was something else, an almost imperceptible electricity in the air, that I couldn't place. The door to my unit opened before I could even knock. She was standing there, framed by the doorway, and for a moment, I froze. She looked effortlessly graceful, her posture relaxed yet commanding, as if she inhabited the room as naturally as the sunlight that streamed behind her. She must have been in her early 40s, but there was a confidence in her that made her feel timeless. Her dark hair fell softly around her shoulders, catching the light in gentle waves, and her eyes held a quiet spark, curious yet teasing. "Welcome," she said, her voice low but warm, with a soft lilt that made my stomach tighten slightly. She handed me the keys, her fingers brushing mine just briefly, but long enough that I felt a faint pulse of heat travel through my hand. It was subtle, almost accidental, yet it lingered in a way that made me suddenly very aware of her presence. I stepped inside, trying to focus on the apartment itself, but my attention kept drifting back to her. She moved with a quiet elegance, adjusting a stack of papers on the counter or tucking a stray strand of hair behind her ear, and even these small gestures felt magnetic. I noticed the faint scent of jasmine she carried, blending with the warm wood and sunlit air of the apartment, creating a strange, intimate comfort that immediately put me on edge. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, the rent, the rules, the brief outline of how things worked, but even in those ordinary conversations, there was an unspoken rhythm. When she spoke, her eyes held mine just a moment longer than necessary. When she handed me a small note or pointed toward a shelf, our fingers brushed lightly, almost shyly, and each touch seemed to echo with meaning I wasn't yet ready to interpret. There was a warmth in her presence that I didn't expect. She smiled softly, not the kind of smile that forced itself, but the kind that lingered in your mind afterward, the kind that made you feel noticed without words. I felt a nervous thrill at the age difference, her maturity, her quiet confidence, yet also a sense of ease, as if this meeting had been written into some quiet, fated moment. By the time I placed my boxes down and took a deep breath, the apartment felt less like a new space and more like the beginning of something unknown, something charged with a subtle tension I couldn't name. As she turned to leave, our eyes met one last time, and I noticed a faint, teasing curve of her lips, a glance that hinted at secrets unspoken. I knew, without fully understanding why, that this would not be just another rental arrangement, it was the start of something that would linger far longer than the scent of jasmine in the hallway. The next few days passed in a quiet rhythm, the kind that makes time feel both slow and heavy with anticipation. I was beginning to settle into the apartment, but each routine task, the mail, the light maintenance, the little notes about utilities, seemed to carry an unspoken weight whenever she was around. The landlady's presence had a way of filling the space, not just physically but emotionally, as if the apartment itself leaned toward her warmth. Our interactions were casual on the surface, yet under every glance, every fleeting touch, I felt a subtle tension I couldn't ignore. She moved with effortless grace, bending slightly to check a cupboard or lean over to examine a leaky faucet, and I found myself noticing the gentle curve of her shoulders, the way her hands moved with quiet purpose. When she handed me a pen to sign a receipt, our fingers brushed again, softer this time, almost apologetically, but it left a strange, lingering warmth on my skin. We began to talk more during these small interactions, conversations that were simple in content but rich in undercurrents. She asked about my work, my day, my plans, and I found myself lingering over my words, conscious of the slight tilt of her head, the way her eyes softened when she listened. There was a playful spark in her glances, just subtle enough to make my heart skip without being obvious. I realized I was watching her closely, noting the little details, the faint laugh that escaped her lips when she caught me staring, the way her fingers toyed with a ring on her hand absent-mindedly, or how she subtly leaned closer when explaining something, the space between us shrinking almost imperceptibly. One afternoon, she had to show me the laundry room, and I followed behind her, trying to act casual while my pulse quietly raced. As she opened the door, our hands met for a fraction of a second while passing the keys to the room. It wasn't dramatic, but it was enough to make me aware of the soft brush of her skin, the faint warmth that lingered long after we separated. I caught her eyes and felt an almost imperceptible smirk, as if she noticed my reaction and chose not to comment. The apartment began to feel less like my space alone and more like a shared world, one threaded with subtle connections that only I seemed to notice. I became aware of her presence in ways that went beyond sight. There was the faint scent of her perfume in the kitchen when she had just left, the quiet rhythm of her footsteps in the hall, the way the air seemed to change whenever she was near. Even in these ordinary moments, I felt a quiet fascination growing, tangled with a sense of propriety and hesitation. I wanted to linger, to find excuses to stay near her, to hear her voice just a little longer. And yet, there was an unspoken boundary I didn't want to cross too soon, a delicate line between admiration and something more intimate that I wasn't ready to define. By the end of the day, I realized that these small interactions, hand touches, shared glances, soft laughs, were no longer just casual exchanges. They had become the threads of a deeper connection, weaving an invisible tension between us. I left the apartment that evening with a sense of anticipation I hadn't expected, wondering what the next day might bring, and whether the quiet, graceful woman who was my landlady might also be the quiet, graceful beginning of something more. A sudden rainstorm hit that evening, turning the city streets into rivers of reflected lights and murmurs of falling water. I was just about to step out when a soft knock at my door caught me by surprise. It was her, standing in the doorway with her hair slightly damp from the drizzle, a casual scarf wrapped around her neck, and a look of mild apology in her eyes. "The power's out again," she said, her voice calm but carrying an underlying amusement. "I thought you might be stuck in the dark." I gestured for her to come in, and she stepped inside, shaking off her umbrella. The apartment suddenly felt smaller, warmer, somehow more intimate with both of us trapped inside the same space. The lights flickered once and then went out completely, leaving us bathed in the soft glow of the rainy evening streaming through the windows. For a moment, we just stood there, quiet, listening to the rhythm of rain against the panes, the city muted by the downpour. She reached for a blanket on the couch and draped it over her shoulders, then paused. Without thinking, I moved closer, helping to tuck it around both of us. Her warmth pressed lightly against my chest, and I felt an unexpected steadiness in her presence, a quiet reassurance that made my pulse both faster and calmer at the same time. Our hands brushed again, this time lingering just a moment longer, and I could feel the subtle thrum of electricity in the shared space between us. We sank onto the couch, not touching overtly but close enough that our knees almost met. Conversation drifted naturally, beginning with mundane topics, the weather, the apartment, small city news, but gradually it found its way into more personal territories. She spoke of her childhood neighborhood with a fondness that softened her usual composed demeanor, and I found myself sharing stories of my own life, my own hopes and small insecurities. There was a raw honesty in her laugh, the kind that made the apartment feel warmer than any light could. At one point, our hands rested near each other on the blanket, almost touching again. Neither of us moved, but I could feel the silent communication in that small, shared space, the gentle reassurance, the quiet curiosity, the unspoken acknowledgement of something more lingering between us. Her eyes caught mine for a moment, and I noticed a flicker of something almost vulnerable, a softness behind her usual confidence. I wanted to reach out, to bridge the space, but held back, sensing the delicate balance of trust and restraint that hung between us. The rain eventually lightened, but neither of us moved to leave. In that simple shared silence, I realized that our connection had shifted. We were no longer simply tenant and landlady, something deeper was forming in the quiet moments, in the shared laughter, in the lingering touches that neither of us forced. It was subtle, yet undeniable, a slow, steady pull toward intimacy, a recognition that the ordinary could carry extraordinary meaning if felt together. By the time she left, the air felt charged, yet comforting. She gave a small, almost shy smile and a slight squeeze of my shoulder before stepping back into the evening rain. I closed the door slowly, my chest still warm from the closeness, my mind alive with the realization that this was the first moment I truly wanted to linger, to stay close, not just in proximity, but in understanding. And I knew, somehow, that she felt it too. A week had passed, and our interactions had settled into a rhythm that was comfortable yet electric, each glance and touch loaded with attention neither of us openly acknowledged. That evening, I had just returned from work, bags in hand, when I heard her soft voice calling from the living room. She was standing by the kitchen counter, leaning slightly against it, her posture casual but deliberately composed. The warm light of the room caught the subtle highlights in her hair, and I noticed the way her eyes held mine with a mischievous glimmer that made my chest tighten instantly. "I was thinking," she said slowly, tilting her head just enough to give that hint of playfulness I had begun to recognize, "that you don't need to pay rent tonight." Her lips curved into a teasing smile, but her eyes, those sharp, expressive eyes, were alive with an unreadable promise. I froze, caught between disbelief and something far more thrilling, the corners of my mind scrambling for an appropriate response. "No rent tonight?" I repeated, trying to keep my voice casual, but it came out uneven, betraying my nervous excitement. "Yes," she said softly, stepping closer. Her hand brushed mine as she reached for a cup on the counter. The contact was brief, but the warmth lingered longer than the touch itself, an electric reminder of her presence. "But," she added, leaning on her elbow and letting her fingers graze mine again, "you can pay me, in a different way." The words hung between us, heavy yet unspoken in their true meaning. I could feel my pulse racing, aware of the small space separating us, the fraction of an inch where her warmth met mine but didn't fully merge. I noticed the subtle curve of her lips, the tilt of her head, the almost imperceptible sway in her posture. Everything about her radiated confidence, yet there was a softness in her expression that suggested she enjoyed watching my reaction as much as I was drawn to her. I cleared my throat, struggling to find composure. My mind raced with possibilities, each one more thrilling than the last, but I knew this was a test of restraint as much as desire. She seemed to sense my hesitation, her smile widening slightly, but it remained gentle, playful, never pressuring, an invitation without demand. The air between us felt alive, charged with the subtle tension of curiosity and unspoken longing. We stood like that for a moment, her hand hovering near mine, the quiet hum of the apartment amplifying every subtle movement, the soft brush of her sleeve against my arm, the faint fragrance of jasmine lingering in the air, the gentle catch in her breath as she tilted her head closer. It was intoxicating, yet entirely safe, a dance of proximity that teased without crossing boundaries. Finally, she leaned back just enough to let the moment breathe, her eyes sparkling with a combination of amusement and intent. I felt a mixture of exhilaration and nervous restraint. This playful proposition had shifted the dynamic between us irrevocably. She wasn't just my landlady anymore. She was a presence that demanded attention, a quiet challenge to my composure, and a magnetic pull towards something more. As I set my bags down, I realized that tonight was the beginning of a new rhythm, one where each touch, glance, and unspoken word would carry the weight of possibility. And somehow, just being in her presence felt like stepping closer to something I both feared and desperately wanted. The evening hung between us like a delicate thread, tense and shimmering. Her playful proposition from earlier still lingered in my mind, a tantalizing echo that made ordinary sounds, the creak of the floor, the distant hum of city traffic, feel magnified, charged. I hadn't expected her to move so close, yet here she was, casually leaning against the doorway, letting the soft light catch the curves of her face and the warmth in her eyes. The apartment seemed smaller now, the space between us more deliberate, more intimate than ever. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady and teasing, and I felt my chest tighten. I wanted to say something clever, to mask the way my pulse had sped, but the words tangled in my throat. Instead, I shifted slightly, careful not to step back, careful not to make it obvious that the proximity was affecting me far more than it should. Every subtle movement she made, the gentle brush of her hair from her shoulder, the light sway of her stance, felt amplified, like the world had narrowed to just the two of us. Her hand brushed mine again, this time almost accidentally, but the touch lingered just long enough to send a shiver up my spine. I could feel the warmth of her skin through the faint friction of contact, the subtle pressure of her fingertips, and my mind instantly raced with the possibilities, each one a delicious mix of hesitation and desire. She noticed my reaction, I could tell from the slight narrowing of her eyes and the faint curve of her lips, playful yet knowing. "I didn't mean to startle you," she said softly, her voice low, almost a whisper, carrying a warmth that seemed to seep into my very chest. I wanted to respond, but the right words escaped me, replaced instead by a nervous laugh, a small smile that betrayed both excitement and uncertainty. Her presence was magnetic, but also intimidating in its quiet authority. We lingered near the counter, talking about mundane things, nothing important, but every word felt charged, every glance weighted with unspoken meaning. I noticed the faint rhythm of her breathing, the slight tilt of her shoulder toward mine, and the gentle warmth radiating from her. I wanted to reach out, to close the gap just a little more, but an invisible line held me back, a sense of respect and propriety mingled with anticipation. The moment stretched, filled with pauses that felt almost deliberate, small touches that seemed accidental yet purposeful. She laughed softly at something I said, and the sound wrapped around me like a soft, intimate blanket. I felt a longing that was both thrilling and terrifying, the kind that made time slow, made each heartbeat loud and meaningful. Finally, she leaned back slightly, giving me the space to breathe, but the air between us remained thick with tension and curiosity. That single evening had shifted something fundamental. I was no longer just a tenant, and she was no longer just a landlady. We had moved into uncharted territory, a place where subtle touches, lingering looks, and shared silences spoke louder than words. As I left the room briefly to set my thoughts straight, I felt a strange exhilaration, a conflicted joy. Desire and hesitation tangled together, leaving me aware of every inch of her proximity, every nuance of her presence, and the undeniable pull towards something deeper. It was intoxicating, unnerving, and entirely impossible to ignore. The apartment was quiet that evening, the soft hum of the city outside blending with the occasional drip of water from the earlier rain. The atmosphere felt unusually intimate, as if the world had receded, leaving just the two of us suspended in a moment that neither of us seemed eager to break. We found ourselves sitting on the couch, a comfortable closeness settling between us, each aware of the subtle heat in the air, the faint brush of our shoulders almost daring to touch. She handed me a cup of tea, her fingers brushing mine lightly. The contact, brief as it was, sent an unexpected warmth up my arm, a gentle reminder of her presence that lingered longer than the touch itself. I realized that these small, seemingly insignificant interactions had become the most charged moments of my day. The world outside, the city, the responsibilities, the routine, melted away whenever she was near, leaving only the quiet resonance of her presence. We spoke softly, not about anything urgent or pressing, but about things that mattered in the small, meaningful ways. She told me about a favorite book she had recently revisited, and I listened, enthralled by the way her eyes lit up as she described the characters and their journeys. I shared a memory from my own past, a quiet vulnerability I had never voiced aloud before. The act of sharing, of opening ourselves to one another, created a tension that was no longer playful but profound, an intimacy grounded in trust and unspoken understanding. At one point, our hands rested near each other on the blanket draped across our laps. I reached out instinctively, brushing a strand of hair from her face, my fingers lightly grazing her cheek. She didn't pull away, instead, she leaned slightly into the touch, her eyes softening, a quiet acknowledgement passing between us that words could never fully capture. It was a gesture loaded with intention, yet delicate, as though the space between desire and propriety had been measured and honored. Her laughter, quiet and genuine, filled the apartment when I stumbled over a thought, and it wrapped around me like a warm, protective cocoon. I noticed the subtle details, the soft curve of her neck, the gentle tilt of her head, the steady rhythm of her breathing, and each one seemed to speak directly to something deep inside me. I realized that I wasn't merely drawn to her appearance or charm, I was captivated by her essence, her quiet strength, and the way she allowed herself to be vulnerably human around me. The rain outside had stopped, leaving the night calm and still. We lingered on the couch, our bodies close but not pressing, our hands occasionally touching in moments that felt deliberate yet effortless. The apartment seemed alive with unspoken words, the tension between us softened by mutual understanding, the excitement tempered by respect. Finally, as the evening drew to a close, she rested her hand gently on mine, a simple gesture that carried the weight of promise and trust. No words were necessary, the connection had already been established. We both knew that what was between us was not fleeting. It was a beginning, slow, tender, and profoundly real, built on shared vulnerability, quiet moments, and the promise of something deeper yet to unfold. The night had settled into a quiet, almost sacred calm. The apartment was bathed in the soft glow of a single lamp, casting warm golden hues across the room, accentuating the gentle curves of the furniture and the subtle movements of her figure as she moved about with that effortless grace I had come to notice in every gesture. The city outside was hushed, the distant hum of late-night traffic blending with the occasional rustle of leaves. In that stillness, the world felt suspended, leaving only the space we shared, charged, tender, and intimate in a way that words could hardly capture. We lingered on the couch for a while, not talking much, simply existing in the comfort of proximity. Her hand brushed lightly against mine as she reached for her tea, and the touch lingered just long enough to make my pulse quicken without urgency. I found myself savoring the quiet steadiness of her presence, the warmth radiating from her in a way that made the room feel smaller, cozier, more alive. Each glance, each subtle movement seemed laden with meaning, the kind that didn't need explanation, only attention. She finally leaned closer, resting her cheek briefly against my shoulder, a gesture so soft and fleeting it could have been mistaken for coincidence. Yet in that moment, I felt the weight of her trust and the quiet affection that had been building between us for days. It was the culmination of everything we had shared, the small touches, the lingering glances, the whispered confessions in the rain, the playful proposition, and the delicate balance of desire and restraint. Each memory threaded together to form a connection that was real, palpable, and undeniably ours. "I'm glad you're here," she murmured, her voice low and warm, carrying both certainty and vulnerability. Her hand remained lightly on mine, the touch deliberate yet gentle, speaking volumes that words could never fully express. I smiled, feeling the tension of hesitation dissolve into something calmer, more enduring, a quiet assurance that we were moving forward together, not out of necessity, but out of choice, out of connection. We shared a lingering hug, the kind that felt like a promise rather than a goodbye. Her arms wrapped around me with a gentle firmness, her cheek resting against mine, and I felt the quiet rhythm of her heartbeat merge with my own. It was a moment of complete emotional honesty, where vulnerability and desire coexisted safely, warmly, without any need to rush. Every doubt, every hesitation, every social barrier melted away, leaving only the undeniable truth of our bond. When I finally stood to leave for the night, she lingered at the doorway, watching me go with a soft smile, her eyes reflecting both contentment and the hint of anticipation. I turned back for a final glance, and we exchanged a quiet, knowing look, an acknowledgement that this was only the beginning. The story of us was far from over, but tonight had closed a chapter beautifully, leaving a space for what was to come, a slow, steady, and deeply felt connection built on trust, affection, and the undeniable chemistry that had drawn us together from the very first day. As I stepped out into the night, I carried with me the warmth of her presence, the echo of her touch, and the certainty that something extraordinary had begun. For the first time in a long while, I felt at home, not just in the apartment, but in the quiet, magnetic pull of a connection that promised to grow, slowly and deliberately, into something unforgettable. If you felt the tension, the warmth, and the slow burn connection between them, don't forget to like this video, subscribe for more age gap romance stories, and hit the notification bell so you never miss a moment of forbidden attraction and heartfelt romance. Share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you were in his shoes?